documentary photograph is not a factual photograph per se. It's a photograph which carries the full meaning of the episode. Dorothea Lange. It's October 2010 and welcome to episode 3 of The Naked Photo. In today's episode, we're going to look at the photograph of Florence Thompson and her family that was entitled Migrant Mother. It was done by Dorothea Lange in 1936 in California. This photo has been called the definitive photo of the Depression, depicting and representing an era. It very quickly took on that larger meaning, more or less as soon as the San Francisco Chronicle published it, and it catapulted Dorothea's career. It defined her work forever, and in later years generated quite some controversy around the ethics of photographing people in distress, when Florence revealed herself to be the mother. She also revealed that she felt deeply embarrassed by having her poverty and desperation revealed to the world, and that she came to feel exploited by the photograph. Ironically, even though this is Dorothea's most famous photo, she never made a cent from it, because she never actually owned the photograph. Dorothea was the daughter of German immigrants, and she grew up in New Jersey on the east coast of the U.S. She studied photography under Clarence White, a famous member of the photo secession in New York at Columbia University. And two events shaped her early life. She got polio as a child, which left her with a permanent limp in her left leg. And her father left the family when she was a teenager. This was so traumatic that she changed her name in response to it, from Nutzhorn to her mother's maiden name, Lange. The pain and embarrassment that she felt as a child left a permanent mark on her. Not only did it give her empathy for the underdog, above all, it made her strong. In 1918, after she finished her studies, she and a friend decided to travel the world, and they were going to pay their way by selling photos. They traveled to the West Coast and got stranded in San Francisco when their money was stolen. She promptly got a job in a studio, and she soon opened a portrait studio of her own in Berkeley. She quickly became successful and established as a portrait photographer, and she continued to make portraits for the next decade, riding the wave of success that was the Roaring Twenties. But her idyllic world of making photographs of wealthy patrons were about to be rocked to the core by an environmental and economic catastrophe that she had no control over, but that her conscience could not ignore or avoid responding to. In 1929, the Great Depression hit the U.S. like a tsunami, and it was followed in the 1930s by a massive drought in the central U.S. states. This era came to be referred to as the Dust Bowl years. The farming community had not been doing well through the 1920s while the cities had been booming, and now the drought and the depression made the economic collapse complete. Suddenly, massive quantities of people were being uprooted, and they were being blown westwards, together with the massive dust clouds that were being churned up on the fallow farmlands. This is the beginning of a massive social shift in the U.S., where society moved from being a rural one to being a predominantly urban one, and it all happened in less than a decade. Dorothea wrote about how she would watch this flow of beaten and broken humanity move past her studio, and feeling touched by the pain and the tragedy of it all. One day, she took her camera and she walked out of the front door of her studio, and she took a photograph of a man in the streets. She printed it. She hung it on the wall of her studio. She had no idea why she did it or what she intended to do with it. She was simply allowing herself to be driven by what she wanted to do. The almost universal comment by clients and colleagues were, "Why did you do that?" or "What are you going to do with that?" Dorothea honestly had no idea, but she was not scared to follow her intuition. And eventually it would lead her out of the studio and make her into a seminal photojournalist. Soon she found herself working for the Farm Security Administration. This is a government agency set up under the New Deal to assist and support the now rapidly collapsing farming community. Her job was simple: promote the hardships with photographs. All the work she produced would be owned by the government, and all the rights would be free to increase the usage and circulation via the printed media of the day. In fact, today you can still get free copies of her work online. She was given a Graflex camera and a car, and she hit the road to find and document these ex-farming families who were now reduced to being migrant laborers, living out of their cars and moving from one temporary minimal wage job to the next. One of these families was the family of Florence Owens Thompson. She was a Cherokee woman from Oklahoma. Her husband had died, leaving her with 7 children, the youngest being a mere baby, and a farm that was staggering under the weight of the depression and the drought. After a few months, Florence realized they couldn't survive on the farm. So they loaded up the old Hudson, they abandoned the farm, and they hit the road to follow the flow of humanity that was heading west. They were eking out a living by doing whatever she and the older children could find to do, whether that would be washing dishes, picking peas, or cleaning. It was an incredibly hard life. They were constantly on the move, and she and the older children would move from short-term job to short-term job. But somehow they managed to keep life and limb together as they slowly moved from place to place, constantly heading west. Florence was actually quite a beauty in her youth. Her children said that she loved dancing and laughing. But now her full dark hair had become dull and matted from a lack of nutrition and the hard life on the road. She had beautiful, finely boned hands, but they were now hard and calloused from the hard labor. But if Florence was anything, she was a survivor. She worked at keeping her children's spirits up, and when they didn't have enough to eat, she would go without, simply saying she was not hungry that day. On the fated day that Florence and Dorothea crossed paths, the old Hudson was the one that finally gave up and blew a radiator. The Thompson clan managed to coast the car into a pea pickers camp, where the oldest boys took out the radiator and headed into town to see if they could get it fixed up. Meanwhile, Dorothea was driving back home after the day's work. The story goes that she saw the handwritten sign for the pea pickers camp, that she drove 20 miles past it before she changed her mind and headed back to see what she could find. I'll let her tell the story in her own words of what she saw when she arrived in the camp. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother, as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said they'd been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. Dorothea recalled some of the details incorrectly when she gave this interview over 20 years later, but it didn't change the essence of the encounter. And though her son said that she made 6 exposures, there were only 5 exposures of this encounter that was sent to the FSA. Dorothea approached Florence through her camera, gradually coming closer and gradually honing in on a cleaner and more powerful composition. The words between them were sparse. Florence maintained her dignity, and Dorothea was working fast, probably partially to minimize the embarrassment of it. This whole encounter probably lasted less than 10 minutes. In the sequence of photographs, you can observe how Dorothea moves from trying to show the broader context with some people in it to actually just showing the people. She was working the scene and honing in on making art as well as documenting the moment. One of her famous sayings was that photographers stop photographing a subject too soon before they've exhausted the possibilities. I think one of the critical things to understand here is, unlike some of the other FSA photographers, mainly Walker Evans, who believed that documentary photography should be objective, Dorothea actually believed in the idea of social change being possible through documentary photography. She believed that if she could frame this picture in the right way, she could send a message to the world and it would change the world and relieve the suffering.